Hi, John.
Hi, how are you, Kim?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being on Simple Politics. So for our viewers, this is John Allen, NBC, MSNBC senior political correspondent, national political correspondent, also author of 3 books, basically autopsies on various presidential candidates and now President of the United States, Joe Biden. So thank you for being on. I'm really lots I want to talk about. Not so much exclusively about your book. I want to just put the flag out there. What I want to do is break down a little bit for people. First, what does it take to win a presidency?
That's a great question. I think in all cases, it takes a ton of money, a ton of hard work. But I think the most important thing is having a message that is about what you're going to be able to do for other people that they actually want and trust you to deliver. And I know that's a couple of concepts in one, but it really is sort of a through line, right? And I think usually the person who's elected president has figured out what it is that people want that they are uniquely qualified to give. In the case of Joe Biden, I think it was, competent governance, good character, and compassion.
Governance, character, and compassion. I think we're seeing that as you were joining. I was underscoring this epic legislation that is going to actually do something about poverty, which I think a few years ago people thought was virtually impossible in 2021. But you wrote, your last book was called Shattered. It was about a failed election campaign by Hillary Clinton. So I wonder if Joe Biden was lucky, which is the name of your new book, was she unlucky, or is it because he had what you just explained, that is, a message and one that people wanted?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of factors, and certainly there are always external events in political campaigns that you can't really predict. I mean, who could have predicted that we would be suffering a plague when Joe Biden decided he wanted to run for president? At the same time, I think in Hillary Clinton's election, there were so many breaks that went against her, and some of them were sort of self-inflicted wounds. Having a private email server at the State Department, not really ever being able to deal with that issue throughout the campaign is self-inflicted. That's not like sort of a bad break. And you see all of the things, that went behind that were connected to that. Jim Comey and what he said when he wrapped up that investigation, and then coming back at the end and reopening the investigation. I mean, all of those things are sort of linked to the original problem. And ultimately, and not to go too back into history, I mean, ultimately, that may have been, overdone. I mean, we know that political officials, government officials frequently use private email in various ways, and she did it in a unique way, I think. But I don't know. I mean, I think the consequences for her were probably greater than they would have been for most politicians. As far as Biden goes, when we talk about lucky, it's not just him, and we can talk about the breaks that he goes through, but the Democratic Party was lucky to find its way to Joe Biden. When he started, he was a 2-term former vice president with about 1/3 of the party behind him. Barack Obama wasn't behind him. Very few of the party elites were really, pushing for Joe Biden, and the sort of feeling, the sentiment of the Democratic Party was moving left. I think the Democrats were lucky to end up with him. And after January 6th, and maybe even before that for many others, you'd say the country's lucky. I mean, the Republic held.
Right, and you and I talked about this in other contexts numerous times about how democracy was on the ballot, and the Constitution and it's still flailing a bit. But I wonder if you could sort of paint the picture of Joe Biden's failing candidacy and his campaign. And I say that because, sort of metaphorically, when you think of the stories like the tortoise and the hare, or even Cinderella, sort of these mythical figures that bear on sort of the human condition, it seems like Joe Biden was way not only not the person that was getting all the money, he was not getting people showing up at his events, and he was the guy that no one wanted to sit at the lunch table with. Is that fair to say when it comes to the political elite within the Democratic Party? Can you paint that picture for people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the one thing, just to start with what he had as a strength, is he had about a third of the electorate divided among African Americans and some moderate centrist white voters. But the trouble that he was having was really unusual for somebody with his standing. He started to campaign in Iowa. It wasn't going very well. His a sort of soft coup was engineered against his campaign manager starting in November of 2019. Nobody really knew that was going on.
What do you mean a soft coup? Just to stop you for a second.
So
Explain what that means.
his senior advisors decided that the problems the campaign was having were largely had to do with his campaign manager, and so they started to try to figure out how to move him out to give more power to other people in the campaign, and they started courting Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, who had just ended as campaign manager with Beto O'Rourke. They started courting her in November of 2019. She wouldn't actually appear on the scene until March of 2020, which also, she had some personal issues she was dealing with. Her father was sick, but the fact that it took 4 or 5 months to get her on board is an indication of where Biden stood. If you look through the caucus process, he comes in fourth in Iowa, disappointing fourth in Iowa. He comes in fifth in New Hampshire. He says he's got to get second place in Nevada to even keep his campaign alive. And by the way, while he was in New Hampshire, his aides came to him and said, "You're so far out of money, you need to consider refinancing one of your houses to keep the payroll going." The subtext of which is it might be time to end this campaign. He gets to Nevada. He ekes out a second place over Pete Buttigieg, far behind Bernie Sanders, who at that point had won 2 in a row and came in second in Iowa, but a very close second to Pete Buttigieg. And Mike Bloomberg is sort of bearing down on him. You'll recall Elizabeth Warren in a debate with Bloomberg before the Nevada caucuses just destroyed Mike Bloomberg on stage, but he's looming over Biden. I mean, this guy is, within an inch of his political life really for months on the campaign trail. And even one of his best friends, John Kerry, was in Iowa 2 days before the caucuses on the phone with somebody trying to go through what it would take for Kerry to get into the presidential race. He said, "I have to get off the board of Bank of America to do that. I'd have to give up my paid speaking engagements." I mean, the loss of faith in Biden mirrored the lack of faith at the beginning among the party elites, and then all of a sudden, boom, South Carolina, and he takes off.
So I want to talk about South Carolina in a minute, but again, what about his closest political allies? You would think Barack Obama, right? 8 years in the White House. What happened with that relationship? Why wasn't Biden sort of blessed by Obama early on? Was it something about Biden that not just that the money was going other places, but were people thinking, listen, Biden just can't make it. He's not electable.
In 2014, I was in the White House briefing room when Jay Carney, then President Obama's spokesman, but a former aide to Biden, was briefing the press. And I asked him, will President Obama endorse Joe Biden? That was for the 2016 race. And I sort of prefaced it and said, twice now, President Obama has told the American public that Joe Biden is the next best person to be president. Will he endorse him? And Carney, sort of walked away from the question. He smiled. I mean, he knew what I was getting at. And, Obama encouraged Biden not to run, or certainly didn't encourage him to run. And aides to Obama told Biden that the writing was on the wall that he shouldn't run in 2016. And Biden resented that a lot. Fast forward a little bit to 2020, or really 2019, and Biden has said publicly that he asked Obama not to endorse him. What Amy and I report in the book is that conversation never happened. It sounded kind of ridiculous at the time, and we went and chased it down. And Biden never made that request. He would have loved Obama's endorsement. Obama was so worried about Biden's performance that he called Biden aides into his office before Biden got into the campaign and said, I want to know everything I can about what you're going to do in this election, and I'm not talking about how you're going to win it. Obama didn't think he was going to win it. He said, I want to know how you're going to prevent Biden from embarrassing himself. And he was worried, obviously, about Biden harming his own legacy, but I think he was worried about Biden harming the legacy of Obama as well.
I mean, that's a stunning thing to hear, in part because, you know, when we look at Biden so far, I mean, that kind of thing in Washington, you would think would create a lot of bitterness. And we saw 4 years of a president who, you know, you cross him, you disagree with him. I mean, it's revenge time, and I think that's still ongoing. So, in your reporting, what is it about Joe Biden that doesn't make him bitter, and also that made him stay in the race? I mean, it's just such a kind of a stunning comeback kid type story where he didn't have the money. He's going to have to, by your reporting, mortgage his house, or that's a recommendation. His closest allies, after all these years in Congress, are turning their backs on him, and he's hanging in there.
Yeah, I mean,
that's amazing.
we talk about this in the book. I mean, here's a childhood stutterer who grew up to filibuster on the Senate floor. This is somebody who's used to overcoming things, not just in politics, but in life. I mean, he lost a daughter and a wife when he was 29 years old. He lost a son to brain cancer. You know, I think he's able to see politics in its proper context with regard to life. And so few people in the political game are able to do that. And, you know, at the same time, I mean, he's just somebody who has this belief in himself that others sometimes think is a little bit delusional, right? He's run for president twice before and not done very well. There were several times where he wanted to run for president and didn't end up doing it. And so for him to go out and tell people, yeah, I'm going to run for president and win this time, you know, it would be reasonable for some of the people around him to say, well, you know, you said that last time. But his belief in himself really shone through. And I think that was important in this particular election year, because I think Americans needed to believe in themselves and needed to believe things were going to get better. And they needed to believe that the person telling them that story was being honest with them, that it wasn't just sunshine being blown at them. And so Biden, with this, you know, sort of enduring optimism and belief in himself, actually did come back. And he didn't.
So talk about
he didn't
that.
overpromise.
Can you he didn't overpromise, and I want to get back to Hillary and your original point that you need a message. And I want to ask you, you know, what are the messages of the last presidents that have won? But let's first get Joe Biden out of his slump. And I wonder if you could explain, who is Jim Clyburn, and what did he do for Biden, or to your earlier point, for the American people, to turn the Democrats' race in a direction that ended up winning the presidency? I think this is a really important story to hear, particularly because of the shenanigans that are going on, you know, around voting since the November election, with proposals to restrict voting, and Jim Clyburn's position in this story. I think it's really amazing.
Yeah, so Jim Clyburn's a House Democratic whip. He's the highest ranking Black member of Congress. And we go kind of deep into this in the book, just sort of about his importance and his meaning. He was first elected in the early 1990s, around the time that Newt Gingrich had a bunch of redistricting plans across the country that basically got rid of moderate white Democrats in the South and replaced them with conservative white Republicans and African Americans, basically packing African Americans into single legislative districts so they would have less influence across districts. And when that happened, there was a bumper crop of African American members from the South, which tilted the balance of power in the Congressional Black Caucus away from the Charlie Rangels and John Conyers and the sort of northern urban African American representatives. And once that sort of took hold, Clyburn became, you know, he was the best liked, the most politically able of that group of Southern Black Congress members. And he, you know, started elevating up the leadership rung in Democratic politics, winning internal elections. All of which is to say, Jim Clyburn has a lot of influence with the Congressional Black Caucus in particular, and that means he has relationships all across the South in majority African American districts. Within South Carolina, he's easily the most influential Democratic figure and also the most influential African American figure. And so Biden really wanted his endorsement pretty badly. I mean, his endorsement is both kind of a bellwether of where the black voters are in South Carolina and sometimes across the South, and also an influencer of what's going to happen in other states. And Biden courted his endorsement for months and months, and Clyburn wouldn't give it. And then, a couple weeks before the South Carolina primary, Cedric Richmond, who now works in the White House and was a congressman from New Orleans, he was the national co-chairman for Biden, went to meet for lunch with Clyburn. And Richmond said, look, you got to get off the sidelines now. This campaign is totally off the rails. We basically need a Hail Mary and you're it. And Clyburn still kind of deferred and said, well, we're going to wait for the debate in South Carolina right before the primary, and then I'll make a determination. Night before the debate, Clyburn meets with Biden on a ship in Charleston Harbor. There's a party on a ship in Charleston Harbor, and Clyburn meets with Biden and a couple other members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and Clyburn says to Biden, I really want you to say that you're going to name a black woman to the Supreme Court in tomorrow's debate. Fast forward to the debate the next night, and Biden's not doing it. Clyburn's getting agitated in his seat, and eventually he gets up and runs backstage, finds Joe Biden, and he doesn't literally grab him by the lapels, but he essentially grabs him by the lapels, and he says, don't you dare leave this debate stage without saying you're going to name a black woman to the Supreme Court. Clyburn goes back to his chair, commercial break ends, Biden comes back and kind of awkwardly mumbles out that he's going to name a black woman to the Supreme Court. Next day, Clyburn comes out with this full-throated endorsement, and it wasn't just like a statement, I endorse Joe Biden. It was, my late wife loved Joe Biden. It was a very emotional statement. And I think, not only is my analysis say, but the sources Amie Parnes and I talked to for this book said, look, Biden might have won South Carolina without Jim Clyburn. He would not have won by the huge margin that he did. And that margin triggered a consolidation within the Democratic Party that was trying very hard to defeat Bernie Sanders. There's a big fear of either a Sanders victory or a contested convention that would rip the party apart. And so as soon as Biden got that big win in South Carolina, you saw Obama come off the sidelines. He started making phone calls to other candidates, Amy Klobuchar to Pete Buttigieg. Those folks got out of the race and then endorsed Biden. Obama's fundraising network was activated on behalf of Biden. Biden had run completely out of money. He didn't have any operations in any of the Super Tuesday states 3 days later. And so ultimately you see this, massive consolidation. And it owes, in part to Joe Biden having that coalition I talked about a little while ago, partially moderate white, partially African-American. That's a particularly good coalition in South Carolina and also in other southern states, but also, to this Jim Clyburn endorsement that comes through, Elizabeth Warren taking out Mike Bloomberg on a debate stage, the Iowa caucus results not being reported on election night because there was a failure with their computer app, so there was no reporting, which meant, the obituary writers weren't able to write Joe Biden's political obituary. I mean, you just sort of go through moment after moment, and all these breaks are going Biden's way, and he is, well positioned to capitalize on them.
So you're saying it's not Jim Clyburn that was the clincher, but without him, he might not have catapulted to the front.
I think that's right. I mean, so Biden wins South Carolina by 10 points. That's not the moment that changes the Democratic presidential nomination or the presidential election overall. But basically Biden ends up with 49% of the vote, and I think Sanders had about 20% of the vote. That 30-point win is significant. I think it was very reassuring to Democrats who liked Biden but weren't real sure that he could win.
So, what other things that are happening, both nationally and internationally, do you think made an impact? And I'm just going to tick them off. That makes sense to me. Obviously COVID.
Number
Donald
one.
Trump's response to COVID.
Number 1A.
Yeah, and I want to get back to this idea of the messaging and how that compares to Hillary Clinton, who lost spectacularly. I mean, everyone thought, the story is, okay, everyone thought she'd win. She lost. Nobody thought Joe Biden would win, and he won. It's just such a fascinating contrast. But what else is added into the lucky column for Joe Biden, and how much of that is luck and how much of that is Joe Biden?
Well, I think the plague, much as it's crass to describe it as luck, when we talk to people around Biden, people high up in his campaign, close friends and advisors, I mean, they all said that that was something that benefited him. You know, between the coronavirus itself, of course, but the more to your point, Donald Trump's handling of it. It allowed Biden to go off screen and control his message. He didn't have to interact with, you know, he was having trouble on the campaign trail. I mean, I saw him in Iowa, I saw him in New Hampshire, I saw him in South Carolina. Like, he was not, he was not hitting the marks of a presidential contender. He was having some trouble, and you know, I think he was getting better as time went on the campaign trail. I think he was rusty at first, but you know, by going inside for 3-4 months in the middle of the campaign, he was able to control his message. At the same time, Donald Trump's out there telling people to inject bleach into themselves. You know, he's saying one day that you have to control the disease so that you can get the economy going, and then the next day saying that you have to get the economy going regardless of the disease. I mean, nobody could follow what he was saying, and some of it was downright dangerous for people. So, you know, we talked to somebody who related a conversation, but Anita Dunn, who was one of the chief counselors to Biden on the campaign and is still with him as an advisor, had said to an associate while this was going on, COVID is the best thing that ever happened to Biden. What she meant was the ability to control that message, to not make gaffes on the campaign trail, for Trump to go out there and prove that he was incompetent in a crisis. You know, I think most veteran politicians would see a crisis coming on and recognize that there was an opportunity, not to claim that they were doing well, but to handle it reasonably well and claim that they were doing it well. That it was political opportunity, not a bad thing politically. And Trump he didn't understand it. We report that he talked to campaign manager Brad Parscale, and Parscale said, you know, this could be your undoing. Early on, he said, you know, you got to watch out for this COVID thing. Could totally be your undoing. And Trump's response was, what does that have to do with politics?
But what about the 74 million votes for Trump, which is also sort of set a new standard, right? So how much, I don't know. I mean, the COVID,
I think that makes him the biggest loser.
Pardon?
That made him the biggest loser. The most votes ever for a losing presidential candidate.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. But I'm saying, you know, I guess I don't know how persuaded I feel in this moment that COVID was something that really hurt Trump in a way that can give us comfort that that the American populace and voters really understand the importance of electing somebody with some competence when it comes to life and death. I don't know. I mean, it would seem, I put it another way, it would seem he should have lost by a much bigger number.
And this is what we say is, you know, sort of the cautionary tale, and the part of Joe Biden barely won. You know, so many people would want to point to the 81 million to 74 million gap in popular vote. But, you know, when you play chess, you don't win by taking the most pieces, you win by checkmate. And in our system, you don't win by getting the most votes, you win by the Electoral College. And Biden won the Electoral College by 43,000 votes over the pivotal 3 states. That is to say, if Trump had gotten 43,000 more votes in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, he would still be president of the United States. I mean, that's smaller than the 2016 margin that Clinton would have needed to become president over Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which was about 77,000. And so part of this story, and part of the reason that we subtitled the book "Why Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency" is we felt like so many people were missing that this election was a cliffhanger, that it was a nail biter, because polls showed Biden winning going in, you know, winning pretty comfortably, and he ended up winning. A lot of people missed that. But, you know, this book takes readers through election night and just how anxious the people on the Democratic side were, and the people in the map room at the White House on the Trump side were. You know, I mean, they're watching it and they're seeing the same thing, which is essentially a tie in the Electoral College, right? I mean, it's so close. I shouldn't say a tie, but kind of a coin flip, right? Like nobody feels comfortable on election night in either party. And in fact, when Fox News called Arizona for Trump, which is the moment Trump sort of loses his stuff, so to speak, at the White House and starts calling Murdochs, you know, in the Democratic headquarters and Biden's headquarters in Philadelphia, the analysts are looking at the numbers, and they're going, wait a second, Fox can't call Arizona for Trump. It's way too, I mean, for Biden, it's way too close.
So what was Trump's winning message then? Back to your original point, you need a theme, so again, take us back as far as maybe starting with Bush. What was the message? I mean, just for those who joined us later, my first question was, what do you need to win a presidential election? Your answer was twofold: money, number one, and two, a message that people want. So what was the message for the winning candidate? And then what was Hillary Clinton missing that Joe Biden had?
I mean, Donald Trump's basic umbrella was America first. And he was able to pack a lot of things under it, right? He was able to pack in protectionism on trade. He was able to talk about draining the swamp, which obviously he didn't do, and I don't think he had any real intention of doing, but as sort of a contrast with Hillary Clinton. I think he talked about immigration, so not on the trade level, but he was trying to deliver a promise about focusing on the well-being of Americans who are here and citizens, and I think that played well for him largely in that first campaign. And then on the other side, he's running against Clinton, who never didn't really come up with reform plans at all. So she basically was the insider that he said she was. And her original message was, I'm with her, which wasn't about anybody else. And the proof in the pudding about some of those other issues, if you look at Biden and the way he campaigned, he's picked up some of that protectionism. Here's a guy who was a global trade guy, like his entire life, comes from a coastal state. And he was for the Trans-Pacific Partnership as Obama's vice president. He was for NAFTA. This is something he believed in. But if you listen to him on the campaign trail this time, there's a lot of anti-China rhetoric, and there was a lot of, sort of, I wouldn't go so far as to say anti-trade rhetoric, but it was in that direction. And so, I think Biden picked up on some of the things Trump had done that were populist, and at least if he wasn't going to mirror them, at least tried to blunt Trump's advantage.
A couple other things in the chat. People are wondering that whether they affected Biden's win. Russia, Black Lives Matter, and Me Too. Of course, there was the allegation of sexual misconduct against Biden that he seemed to have weathered in a way that certainly Donald Trump has, but maybe Andrew Cuomo not so much. So what about those three issues?
So Russia, I don't think so, other than by the absence of effectiveness of Russia, right? I mean, I think they were in there, or trying to be in there as much as possible in terms of social media, but I think they lacked effectiveness this time. I mean, it's hard to prove.
In terms of duping Americans into not voting for Biden.
Right. I just think, look, I mean, I'm sure somebody will do a scientific study of this at some point. That did not appear to me to be, I mean, so few things actually moved the needle in this election. So there are so few persuadable voters at this time. I mean, at this point, both parties are almost entirely focused on finding people who agree with them, who don't normally vote, and turning those people out to the polls. So it's hard to do persuasion to the extent that that Russia was able to involve itself, through social media. It may have been to turn out a few more Trump voters, but I don't think they were effective in knocking down Biden particularly. Black Lives Matter is interesting. Biden embraced some of the goals of police reform, but we write about in the book this internal debate going on in his campaign where some of his senior aides were pushing him to apologize for the crime bill, the 1994 crime bill. Some of them were pushing him to say defund the police, whereas he pushed back and said, "I'm going to put more money into local police." So there was a very intense debate over the period of months in the Biden campaign over how to position himself during the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests for racial justice. And Biden landed on centrism and somewhat compassion for everyone, right? He went to Wisconsin, he went to Texas for the George Floyd Memorial Service. He spoke compassionately about people who had been victims of police violence. He spoke compassionately about protesters, and he spoke compassionately about police at a time when so few people with platforms were willing to do that. We have a scene in the book actually that I think is really telling, where Clyburn is House floor with John Lewis, during the sort of summer of George Floyd, if you will. And Lewis says to Clyburn, "Burn, baby, burn killed us," meaning that I guess the more radical elements of the civil rights movement that came after John Lewis, he was replaced at SNCC by Stokely Carmichael, for example, ended up being destructive to the nonviolent civil rights movement. And so he says, "Burn, baby, burn killed us." And then Lewis says to Clyburn, "Defund the police is going to kill them," meaning Black Lives Matter and its goals. So, you could see even somebody like John Lewis, who was nobody's idea of a shrinking violet, the man who was beaten nearly to death on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, and beaten many other times. He looked at it and said, "Look, this label of defund the police is really not helpful to the people who are talking about it." And then, I'm sorry, the third one was Russia, Black Lives
And the
Matter.
other was the Me Too movement.
Oh, and the Me Too
and
movement,
the
yeah.
allegations against Biden that didn't seem to stick in a way that it has stuck with some and has not stuck with others.
It is not his intent, not his instinct to apologize publicly for anything. We go through this in the book with the original allegations from Lucy Flores, that he had sniffed her hair and kissed her head or whatnot at a campaign event a couple of years earlier. And his aides told him what was being reported, and his reaction was kind of like, "Wait, I didn't do that," or not like that. And I think he was a little surprised, but also when they told him he needed to apologize, he was very uncomfortable with that idea. And even when he did sort of face to camera video, it was kind of like, "I'm sorry that you felt that way, and I'll be more cognizant of my behavior in the future." As for
We've
terror,
all had those apologies in our life.
Yeah, right. Sort of sorry. And then, we don't really get into Tara Reid in the book. And one of the reasons is that we didn't do enough of our own reporting. I mean, this book is coming out in March, right after a November election. I mean, we did it in pretty fast time. We didn't do enough of our own reporting on that to feel comfortable trying to figure out where it landed. I mean, because it was such a he said, she said.
It was, and she had some holes in her story. But what about Kamala Harris? Because I'll tell you, when I watched that debate where she sort of used that comment, "I was that little girl," sort of attacking him on race, and then he chooses her to be the vice president, obviously, and she's now the vice president. Did you do any reporting on that relationship and how that unfolded? I'd love to understand that, because I thought, I'll be honest, John, when I watched that, I don't know. To me, it didn't bother me about Joe Biden. To me, it looked a little, just didn't make Kamala Harris look her best self for me in that moment.
Yeah, we actually devote basically a whole chapter to that debate and the preparation that went into Kamala Harris's hit and the reaction of the Biden campaign and the counter reaction of the Harris campaign afterward. She was in a position where she had not been getting a lot of media attention. She seemed to be falling off. She wanted to make a move. The best way to do that was to go after Biden. And particularly, I think the thinking was that if she could take down Biden, it would show that she was somebody who was tough enough to take on Trump. And so she goes through with the hit. And we even go into how they decided to preface it with, "I know you're not a racist, Joe," or whatever those words were. That let everybody know she was about to call him racist. I think there were some deep resentments about that afterward. Biden, she was the obvious pick for him for a lot of reasons, including the fact that he had self-limited to women. And then, after the George Floyd protests in that sort of summer, it seemed more likely that he would choose an African-American running mate, particularly because he was not generating as much enthusiasm among African Americans in some places as he would have liked. So, she was an obvious pick in a lot of ways, and still he went through a very, very long process of eliminating everyone else. And even a couple of days before he picked her, he called Jim Clyburn and said he was kind of having a struggle between his head and his heart on the vice presidential pick. And obviously his head was with Harris, but his heart was, Amy thinks that Gretchen Whitmer may have been the runner-up. There's some others who say Susan Rice might have been in that position, but he obviously was struggling with the Harris pick in large part because of that attack in June or July of 2019.
So in the chat, there's a question as to whether it's possible to have, a two-term Democrat followed by another Democratic president, in your view. But the broader question I want to ask around that is, what are the takeaways that you and Amy have about what Democrats need to do moving forward when it comes to presidential elections, based on, these excavations, not just of this past election, but the 2016 election?
Well, I think the one thing that they need to do that Biden did right to some extent was to not look at winning a presidential election as an either or, in terms of either you go to your base or you go to the middle. That kind of have to do both. I mean, winning presidential candidates tend to be people who are able to attract the broadest spectrum from their party and sometimes from the other party. And as you know, there are some never Trump Republicans that also voted for Joe Biden in this election. So I think one of the lessons here is that the Democrats have got to figure out a better way to package their agenda, that sort of encapsulates or embraces a greater segment of the electorate. I mean, and I don't mean the overall electorate, because it doesn't, to some extent, doesn't matter how many people in California and New York vote for them. I mean, they should really spend a lot of time figuring out how is it that we win the swing votes in the swing states and the electoral college, because I can tell you the Republicans have that down to a pretty good science of maximizing their electoral college votes per voter. I want to say it's in the last 6 elections, Democrats have won the popular vote 5 times, but the presidency 3 times.
Right, it's pretty stunning, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But I think there is at least a perception that the Democrats don't have their act together as well, in terms of those surgical approaches to these things. So
it's like they're trying to win by kicking field goals.
Yeah.
Just that's not the game. You gotta find the rules.
So what do you, John, I mean, I know that we're a few years out, but I mean, what do you predict, if anything, if you're in that moment for 2024? Is it going to be Donald Trump versus Kamala? If you don't have a view on that, what are you going to be looking for over the next 4 years, or before that? Obviously, presidential campaigns start long before the actual November date.
I mean, I think Donald Trump's the leader of the Republican Party until he chooses not to be. And should he decide that he doesn't want to run for president again, or should he not be able to run for president again, I think whoever gets his endorsement would be a very fortunate candidate in terms of trying to win the Republican primary. I mean, I'm not sure he can confer his status on anyone else exactly, but he is the dominant force in the Republican Party in a way that in modern history we've never seen a defeated presidential candidate continue to be after the election. Normally parties kind of want to distance themselves from their defeated candidates. On the Democratic side, Joe Biden wanted to be president for 40 years. I'm not convinced that he's, wants to just walk away from it. He's keeping Kamala Harris close. You see her a lot. That's frequently interpreted as he's setting her up to run for president next time, and that may be. But he's also keeping his options open, because the more he's in the frame with her, the less she can distance herself from him. And he knows how those relationships go, right? I mean, he got out in front of Obama on same-sex marriage back before the 2012 election. He felt neglected in the vice presidency a lot, even though he didn't necessarily talk about it publicly. So he knows a lot about that relationship, and keeping her close makes it very difficult for her to get out in front of him or to have her ambitions conflict with his.
So it sounds like you buy this sort of notion that Barack Obama, according to your reporting, embraced that that Joe Biden is a bit, can embarrass himself and does gaffes. But what about his cognition? What about his competence? Is that something, it's floating around there that, listen, he's old, he's feeble. What did you all find out about that?
I mean, look, he's not the Joe Biden of 1988 or of 2008 or 2012 or 2016. But I think some of the things that are different about him, and he is, noticeably less quick on his feet, right? But some of the things that have changed about him are benefits to him. I mean, I think, rather than a young man in a hurry, he's an older guy with patience, and I think that and calm, and a temperate tone, and I think all of those things were really helpful for him in this last election. At the same time, I liken it to Tommy John, the old baseball pitcher. He was a fireballer when he was young, and he blew out his arm, and they created a surgery that is now known as Tommy John surgery, where they're doing a ligament replacement from one arm to the other, I guess. And he came back and was, didn't have the fastball anymore, but had, developed an ability to be a good pitcher without it. And, ended up winning 20 games like 3 times after his surgery. So I kind of liken it to that. And I apologize for the baseball reference, but I have to get one in.
Well, as you know, I've got 4 daughters, so I'm not as up on that, but I do enjoy that part of how you explain things in plain terms. But yeah, also it seems like Joe Biden's the guy at this stage in his career who doesn't have a whole lot to lose in his own mind and really wants to implement the stuff that matters to him. He's really implementing his own values, which is probably refreshing. And so we'll have to keep an eye on whether that takes hold outside of how many years we have of him.
Yeah, I mean, it could be 4 years, could be 8 years. I mean, I don't make predictions like that. It seems like a terrible idea to make predictions about who's going to run when and everything. But I think he's pretty happy doing what he's doing right now. I mean, and there's an extent to which, look, it's a little overblown for the folks on the left to say, look, this $2 trillion bill is, it makes him FDR.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is something to him having won and then done sort of old school democratic politics, which is to spend money on the poor and lower middle class, and middle class to an extent, in hopes of lifting their boats. And his view is that if they do that effectively, that they will be rewarded electorally for sort of following their hearts. And, I mean, that you can see in the past times where people have become president and, sort of shifted their focus once they got into office. And I think most of the things will track with his campaign promises. I mean, even the $2 trillion relief bill, like that was a campaign promise. It's perfectly reasonable for the guy who won the campaign to start implementing the agenda that he promised to implement when he got on, when he was campaigning. We'll see what comes after it, though.
Well, now you sound like you're talking for, Trump. When Trump won, that was the same argument about kids in cages and immigration and all these other things that we weathered for 4 years. It's fair, right?
I mean, look, I'm never going to make an excuse for kids in cages, whichever president it's under. I think it's ugly, and we should find a way to be more humane. But to your point, I mean, Democrats were horrified by things Trump said he was going to do, and then Trump won.
And then he won and did them, yeah.
And not enough Democrats showed up. Look, 81 million people voted for Joe Biden, 65 million people voted for Hillary Clinton. I can't imagine that, all 15 million of those people had voted for Trump last time, right? Some of them stayed home.
Well, there you go. And I think that's the message that we have to keep our eye on is it does really matter at the ballot box, right, to vote, which is why we have this pitch battle now around access to the ballot, because Republicans understand that's where the power is, ultimately, is at the ballot box.
There's such an asymmetry there, too. I mean, what Democrats are talking about is like, how do they get more of their people to vote and to vote consistently and to be registered? And what Republicans are talking about is not how to get more people to vote for them, either to persuade them or to turn them out, but to prevent people from voting. Right.
And that's even Republicans or the never Trumpers are admitting that, are saying that. I had Bill Kristol on this show who said, that this is not vague. This is not just a talking point. It's not political spinning. This is really the strategy. And it's not necessarily a failed one.
No, I know it's been successful for generations. I mean, if you go back to Andrew Johnson, I'm sorry, not Andrew Johnson. If you go back to it's the 1876 presidential election, and I don't know why my mind is blanking, but in the 1876 presidential election, the very close one, Hayes and Tilden, there were 4 states where the electoral votes were not accepted by Congress. Basically, it couldn't be counted because at least in 3 of them, there was incredible racial intimidation and violence against Black people trying to vote. And so they had to go through, it took until like a couple days before the inauguration. Back then, the inauguration was in March. It took until a couple days before the inauguration to come up with a compromise by which the North got the presidency with Hayes, and the South got an agreement to pull Northern troops out of the
Yeah.
South, ending Reconstruction. So, this stuff has been going on, basically for as long as anyone, well, much longer than any of us who are alive can
Right.
remember.
And then the South got Jim Crow, and then we got the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and then the Supreme Court gutted that in 2013 with Shelby County versus Holder, and now we're back with HR 1 and HR 4, and the fight over the filibuster, and whether we'll see access to the polls again for brown and black Americans. I mean, it's an old story, and one that I think we overlook, and we take for granted that it's not still a pitched battle in America, but it is, and at least it's not on the table, right, John? Maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really amazing. I suspect it's going to be difficult for the Democrats to get rid of the filibuster. I think that there is enough advantage for enough small state Democrats in having the filibuster as a power.
What about
that
the
they won't go
talking
along with it.
filibuster? Didn't Biden come out today and say, listen, if you're gonna filibuster, you're gonna have to show up and actually do it. If Georgia voters can't get water and food in line, according to the Georgia House bill,
Yeah.
or it's a misdemeanor to bring water and food, they should at least have to physically show up and do the filibuster. Do you think that would make a difference?
Yeah, but I mean, in the old days, the way senators would just trade off,
Right. Or have their staffers do it. Yeah.
and so it doesn't. They actually changed the way the filibuster works so that you could track and do legislative work while there was a filibuster going on. So I'm not sure. I mean, you'd have to craft the rules pretty
Real pain.
precisely. Yeah, and I mean, I think McConnell's warning is in some ways a puff up, right? Like he's puffing his chest out that they're going to destroy the Senate, but also there are ways in which the minority can destroy the Senate, and even worse, make a mockery of it. Refuse to show up for any votes. I mean, it's just again, you're looking at asymmetric warfare. The Republican Party is very much trying to hold on to declining demographics and power and wealth in ways that are increasingly anti-Republican in a smaller kind of way.
Right. I mean, and Mitch McConnell knows how to play those politics, right? He got 3 Supreme Court picks. That's going to affect our children for generations by playing those games. And he's saying, listen, gloves off. If you want to do this, I know how to punch back pretty hard. And that is the concern. That is the concern. But anyway, listen, John, I've taken up a lot of your time. This is absolutely fascinating. Congratulations on the book. Congratulations to your co-author as well. I encourage everyone to take a look, and hopefully we can chat again as this unfolds. A little quieter times.
Anytime.
Okay. Thanks. This is Simple Politics, Kim Wehle. Thanks everybody for joining. Talk soon,
Thanks.
John. Thank you.